This is very, very soft, and the reason I'm showing it is that because there are so few value differences, because the textures are so similar, and there's nothing saturated at all in here, you become very aware of cool versus warm. Like I showed you in my student work, when you limit the kinds of things you can compare, your eye is going to go to the most unique thing. So to make something that is very subtle into the most unique thing, you're going to have to collapse all the other differences to get somebody to look at that. Same story. We've got violets and blues and greens in here, and we have red, oranges, and yellows in here too. And when you see them in similar value here, you start recognizing how cool and warm they are. When you've got a very high contrast, as you do here, you're not going to notice the cool and warm quite as strongly. The genre of salon painting is usually much more about dresses than it is about people, and that's certainly the case here. So this background is chosen to make this dress seem practically iridescent, and not only that, but a very shiny floor to reflect on. The person winds up almost being a mannequin inside a dress because the dress is the subject. Cool and warm light is very obvious here, and this looks like it is incandescent light plus the natural color of these rattan chairs. And anytime you're looking again into the sun, you're probably going to get a sense of cool versus warm light, as we do here. That's a very exaggerated view, though. Speaking of exaggerated views, very, very cool versus warm, and ironically, this looks like noon light. These kind of shadows, these kind of dappled shadows come from the sun being directly above us, and the bright light here is the kind of bright light you get from noonday light, when the light is brightest. You're not going to see this much color at noon. This is a painting, and it's not necessarily trying to be accurate, it's trying to be emotive, let me say. Cool versus warm is what is most fascinating about this, and especially how all the surrounding warmth, all this background I said this incorrectly. All this background coolness emphasizes the warmth in her. So she becomes this enlivened, vital character because of the warmth on her skin as opposed to all the coolness back here. Cool versus warm is something you see simply because of sunset. It is the nature of sunset. So this is very accurate. This is artificial light, and the warmth comes from incandescent light, and this comes from remaining skylight. This is not a midnight painting. This is probably when the sun is near the horizon. Contrast of saturation means that you are comparing dullness to brightness, or excuse me, dullness to intensity. So this is a painting about flower blossoms, and yes, it's called Wild Poppies. It is not about the sky, it's not about dead grass, it's not about trees, and it's not about the costume that the woman is wearing or the child is wearing. It is about the poppies. And you look at the poppies as the content of the painting because they are most saturated. There are 7 color contrasts that we normally talk about, and contrast or saturation is actually one of the most useful to you. This is one way that you can make sure that a viewer is actually going to look at what you want and spend some time studying that thing that you want. Now, I just showed you another version of something like this, so this doesn't have people in it, but it is painted for the same reason, the drama of these poppies. And it is also a complementary contrast, too. Monet's famous Impression Sunrise is remembered for the sun. It's not remembered for the water or the masts of the ships or the cranes or the sky as much as the sun itself because of that saturation. Your eye goes right to that. Okay, much more subtle here. Anders Zorn, a wonderful painter of very subtle textures and very soft light, has given us a creamy white background and creamy white dress, so therefore she looks very flushed. Her skin is the most saturated thing in this painting. She is framed by dark hair and dark eyebrows and dark eyes, but the skin becomes saturated, and therefore, again, she looks more vital in this particular image. Well, that idea is taken to an extreme here because this is a picture of the old story of Pygmalion, the sculptor who was making a statue that he fell in love with and prayed to the goddess, and she allowed the statue to come to life. So this is a statue as she is coming to life, and he's startled that the prayers to the goddess that he made actually came true. That is saturated because it's alive. That is not saturated because it's still stone. Saturation is largely what makes this young girl stand out. This is a very soft light image. There's a lot of moisture in the air, a lot of overcast sky. You're almost living in a cloud here. So that is the most remarkable thing in this particular image. Just like this. It's not girl with shawl, it's girl with green shawl, because the green is very important. Well, there's a lot of color in here. But this color and this are purple. And purple is the additive complement, meaning that when your eye sees green very, very strongly, and you blink, you're going to see a purple afterwards. Also, this is contrast to saturation. This young woman is noted because she's wearing such bright clothes. And that is, in a way, what is so important about her, is she looks like a gypsy because she's wearing bright clothes. Okay, there's a lot of color here. It's a very naturalistic portrait. It is called the School Bells, and it's just a pun. But she is the exception. Nobody, except for this one little touch here, is wearing that color. So it would seem that these two men are actually trying to get her attention, although maybe we're supposed to think her. She is the most unique thing here and the most saturated thing here. Charles Le Brun was not just a painter, he was a color theorist, and he is one of the first in the 19th century that painters actually really took seriously. There is some blue to balance this out, but this is the Virgin Mary, and she is always seen to be wearing blue because blue is the color of the sky, and there is nothing to fight that. She is the most saturated thing here, and she is almost stage lit with a spotlight from above the rafters to come in to make sure that there's no chance you're going to look at anything else but her. Some of that is true here. Saint Hyacinth is in neutrals entirely because he is a mere mortal. So the bright colors are reserved for celestial beings. Some of that's true here, except that in this case Jesus is not celestial yet. There's a lot of blue in the background, which may be part of the reproduction we're looking at. But the angel is there to help Christ, but Christ is the main content of the painting. And he certainly is here. This is very common in paintings from hundreds of years ago, where Christ is going to be the only person wearing very saturated clothing, and everybody else is going to be wearing brown, which is pretty much what you see here. Contrast to saturation, which we talked about earlier with this, is what makes this so compelling. Well, some of it. There's a lot of painting technique in here too. This couple is centered, so there's no doubt that you're going to look at this couple, but you're not going to look at her. She's not lit with the same kind of light that we are lit with here. And he is seen to be a wealthy man because he can afford to wear very bright colors at this point in history. We've talked about this one already, but that is what makes it so remarkable, is the very strong use of saturation. If you were describing this painting to someone else, you would describe it based on that saturated horizon line. This unusual painter was very comfortable painting with very similar value, and this surprises us now. It's this very unusual way to look at things. But the parasol is the content of this painting. She is supposed to be underneath it, and maybe she's supposed to be what we look at because of the hair, but the parasol is one of the most remarkable things about it for color reasons. We've gone through this one also. The fabric is supposed to be very saturated, but contrast to saturation, as I mentioned earlier, is what reminds you that these are living creatures and this is not. Contrast to proportion, when Johannes Itten talked about it, he called it contrast of extension. And what he was thinking of when he talked about it was when you use pairs of complements, the more similar the values are in those pairs of complements, the more you can use an equal amount of those colors. The more the complements are very strongly light and dark, the more you use less of the light color and more of the dark color. So a red-green painting can be equal amounts of red and green, but a blue-violet painting should be 1/4 violet, 1/4 yellow, excuse me, and 1/4 violet. I hope I said that right. It was meant to be a yellow-violet painting being 1/4 yellow, 3/4 violet. That was right that time. We now use this mainly to talk about the proportion of color, the amount of color being used. In this case, that is what is exceptional. There's almost nothing to challenge that amount of color, so your eye goes right there to Persephone's cloak. Here you're somewhat comparing this color to this, and all the colors are sort of kept from each other. There are no transitional areas between the colors. They're sort of neutrals between the colors. So it's large, medium, and small amounts of color that are then repeated in the stained glass window. Again, proportional amount of color because of the way the shadow works. Here the proportion is actually the kind of decorations in the fabric as against the fabric itself. There's also the lipstick against the fabric itself. So this is actually more difficult to work with. This is getting close to Gustav Klimt, but for very different reasons.